Hey, and welcome back to Faith Seeking Understanding Online. You're listening to our third questions video from our module, The Good Life. I'm Matt, and I'm joined here with Roland, and we'll be answering your questions about the Mediator. If you haven't actually listened to the lesson, that might be a good place to start, which you can find on this same page. And if you haven't listened to the rest of the module, up until this point, that might also be a good place to start. So you can also find that all on our website, and as well as all the other modules that we've done. Gonna move that cup away, and anything else that you might want to know about faith seeking understanding, or if we haven't included something there, you can always just ask us. You can find our contact details there too. Should we jump into it?
Let's do it.
Cool. So our first question is actually two questions, but we'll just lump them together and see what happens. Could you unpack the part of the table where you talk about how the old temple needed to be cleansed, but the heavenly temple is never tainted? And how does that work out with the church being said to be the temple?
Yeah, okay. So first we should probably explain a little bit more about the old temple needing to be cleansed, because I just threw it in there, like right at the end, and didn't really give much explanation. And then we can talk about what that looks like in the New Testament. Yeah.
Great.
So in the Old Testament, in the Levitical system, there are 5 classes of offerings. I mean, there's lots of different offerings, but I guess you could talk about the 5 as 5, maybe 4. I'll go through them real quick. So there's burnt, grain, peace, and then sin and guilt offerings are together. So if you split them out, then they can be separate. And those are covered in like the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. And they all have different names. So sometimes a burnt offering is called a whole offering. Sometimes a sin offering is called a purification offering. Sometimes a guilt offering is called a reparation offering. And sometimes a fellowship offering is called a peace offering.
It's just so helpful when the biblical authors have consistent vocabulary for things.
What makes it even more confusing is that a fellowship offering is like further divided into like free will, vow, and all these other things. And then there's a wave offering somewhere in there, and it's like, what should the wave offering be counted as? Yeah, it's literally because the priest waves a piece of meat. It's like when I read it, I'm thinking like,
waves a piece of meat.
See, we did it. We got it, God. We got it.
He was fast, but not too fast for me.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah.
Goodness.
Yeah. So it's quite confusing.
Leviticus is more fun than I thought.
Yeah. It can be quite confusing. Not all of the offerings bring atonement. So that's the key thing here that we're looking at. So remember in the talk I said the way things get cleansed is typically through a process of atonement. Only 3 of the offerings bring atonement. It's the burnt offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. You can treat the sin and the guilt offering as basically the same. The only difference is that the one is given when some monetary recompense needs to be given. So that's why it's sometimes called the reparation offering, the guilt offering. But otherwise, they're done in the same way. They function in the same way. In all that kind of stuff. So the sin offering and guilt offering, it doesn't atone. It atones for the offerer, but it doesn't atone the offerer. It atones the places. So it atones the altar and it atones the tabernacle or the temple. Now that might be a really weird thing for us to hear today, because we think of atonement as a interpersonal thing, right? But that in the term in the Levitical system is a lot broader. A lot of the terms are a lot broader. So we speak about, for instance, people being clean or unclean, but the land can also be clean or unclean. So that's just true of a lot of things. People are holy, but so are the things inside the tabernacle, like the lampstand and stuff. So, yeah. So the sin offering is what atones for the place, and then the burnt offering is what atones for the offerer. Atones the offerer. At least that's how I understand it. And that's interesting because the sin offering is really the focus of the Day of Atonement. So that you will read in Leviticus 16. The real focus of it is the sin offerings given for the priests and for the people. which atone the temple or the tabernacle on behalf of, because of the uncleannesses of the priests and the people, so that the high priest can then go in and, I wouldn't say chill out with God. It's quite a tense situation, but to be in there with God for a second, so that he can atone the mercy seat or the altar, not the altar, sorry, the Ark of the Covenant. He kind of like flicks blood in, I think, if I remember correctly. He like flicks blood in to get like atonement done, and then he gets out of there as quickly as he can. So that's what that does. And I think the way to think about this is like, people become unclean through various ways. Sometimes these ritual ways, and sometimes through like unintentional sin. And the tabernacle becomes unclean or in need of atonement by virtue of being near uncleanness. So when the offerer comes and he's unclean, or when the temple like is in the presence of these uncleannesses of the nation, we need to cleanse the temple so that God can continue living there, because he's holy, and holiness doesn't really coexist very well with uncleannesses. Yeah. So that in the Old Testament, that's how that works, right? So you have the sin offering does the place. So typically what would happen is an offerer would come, they would bring a sin or guilt offering to atone for the place, so they clean the place. Then they clean themselves by putting a burnt offering on top of that. And then they will do the fellowship offering, which allows them to have that meal with God that I spoke about in the talk. So that's how it works in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, that doesn't happen, as I said, because the temple isn't a physical building anymore, right? You don't need any of that sort of stuff. There's now the question asked about the church being the temple, and so we have to be a bit careful, because when Hebrews talks about Jesus as the high priest, when the author talks about the temple, he often doesn't refer to the church as the temple. He refers to the holy places that are like in heaven. So I'll just read Hebrews 9 verse 24 as an example. He says, "For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf." So that's clearly not talking about the church as the temple, but it is true that the New Testament speaks about the church as the temple. So I think the way to think about this is to get clear on what we mean by temple first. So a temple is where God lives. So a temple is where God is present in some way. And so in the Old Testament, that was in the building. That would get unclean by virtue of the uncleannesses of people. In the New Testament, that's more complicated, right? So God lives in his people by his Holy Spirit. So we are his temple in that sense. But God the Father is like in heaven. And so there's like a temple in heaven, or heaven is the temple in some sense. And so you have these different temples that are sort of overlapping and coexisting with each other. And that heavenly temple is what we see sort of spoken of in Revelation, although it says there's no temple, but it talks about how God comes from heaven with the New Jerusalem where he lives with his people. And so that's sort of I think that's sort of what the Hebrews author is picking up on. So there's at least two temples in the New Testament. And it's true in both, for both of them it's true that they don't need to be cleansed like was happened in the Old Testament, as an irregular cleansing. Okay, so Christ has cleansed us once off with his sacrifice, and so now we are clean. We don't need to make any offerings and we don't get tainted anymore. We're purified by his blood once for all. And in an even more true sense, the heavenly places never get tainted and never have been tainted. We at least have been tainted at least once by our sin. That's why we needed atonement in the first place. In the heavenly places, that's where God is. There's never been uncleanness there, and there never will be. And so Christ is now, as a high priest, Christ is now working in that heavenly temple that's never been and never will be tainted. So I think that answers the question. You can tell me if I went on a bit of too much of a tangent there.
No, that's really helpful. I think clarifying what we mean by temple in the New Testament is a very helpful step to make, because you're right, in say Ephesians 2, the church, the people of God, are very much described as the temple, but that sort of language doesn't seem to be there in Hebrews. In fact, the writer of Hebrews doesn't really have much to say about the temple at all. So kind of just ironing that out, and kind of maybe playing a bit more fast and loose with how we talk about the temple. The earthly temples that were made in the Old Testament were kind of a connection point between heaven and earth, where God would dwell. God, who's in the heavens, would dwell among His people who are on the earth, and so there is a sense in which we can actually legitimately talk about just the heavenly part of that, I guess.
Yeah, well, because Christ is the mediator for us. Remember, I said priests are representatives of humans to God, and He is a human. He's ascended. So now we have a presence, right? We have a representative there in the heavenly places, right now, which is Christ. And so, in that sense, there's a connection point between us and God's presence in the heavenly places. Yeah, I like that idea of a connection point like this. The temple is a place in reality where God and creation overlap in a way.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
I don't want to say that in a way that makes it sound like I'm a pantheist or something, but
no, sure. But
his presence can be
that is what I
accessed.
imagine as well. That's kind of the midpoint of the Venn diagram, where we've got we've got that common place where humans and God, in some sense, dwell together.
Yeah, totally.
There is also, just thinking about that now, there's the kind of more typological language to do with the temple and how that's fulfilled in the New Testament, but also the sacrifices in the New Testament. And as much as Jesus is spoken of as a new temple, as a new high priest, he's also spoken of as a new sacrifice, as himself the sacrifice of atonement in Romans 3 or in Hebrews 10. Wondering
the New Testament's actually the New Testament's quite. I think when we read Leviticus, I think when any Christian is reading Leviticus, especially the first 7 chapters, which are like, unless you're super interested in it, quite dry. I think that's fair to say.
Yes.
I think a lot of the time when we read it, we're like, oh, where's Jesus in this? And we try and figure out, like, is Jesus the burnt offering? Does he fulfill the burnt offering? Does he fulfill the grain offering? Does he fulfill, all these things? And I think that might be kind of maybe an unhelpful way of thinking about it in general. I mean, definitely you want to say that he's the fulfillment of these things, but how we think about it I think a better way of thinking about it is he fulfills the sacrificial system as a whole. So he, in his one sacrifice, achieves all the little bits that require all these disparate sacrifices in the Old Testament. So he cleansed the church and he made atonement for the people in one go. So that's both a sin and a burnt offering. Through him we can celebrate fellowship with God. So now we have a fellowship offering, and all these things. He gave it of his own free will. He gave himself up as his own in his own free will, which makes it a free will offering. Like it's just all of these different things together. I guess in the Old Testament you have them separated out. But just like you have like priests and prophets separated out. But in Jesus, they're all coming together into one perfect unity. So it's better to think of it like that than... I'm not saying this is what you were saying, but I think the temptation is to try and find them in the individual things. And it rather is to say, well, what's the system as a whole? What's the function of the system as a whole? And say Jesus fulfills that function in one go in a better way.
Yeah, no, that's a really helpful clarification, and it reminds me of what we said in our second lesson of Module 1, where we spoke about the idea of prophecy and fulfillment, and the idea of just fulfillment in general, and we looked at the album cover of one of Pink Floyd's albums, where you have the various colors going into that triangle thing and coming out with the one white light, where it's kind of all these various elements that we see present in some way in Jesus, just condensed all into one person, one figure.
Yes, yeah. As an interesting side note, when it comes to offerings in the New Testament, you can see that the New Testament authors are quite familiar with it, and it just shapes the way they speak sometimes. So I don't remember exactly where it says it, but towards the end of Paul's life, in one of the, I think it's pastoral epistles, he says, like I'm being poured out as a drink offering. And the drink offering is kind of like the grain offering. It sort of augments an existing offering where you put some wine in the offering. But you can, if you imagine what that's like, right? You have this burning thing, and then you put some wine on to make it like smell a bit nicer. Like the wine is gonna evaporate really quickly, right? It's gonna burn really quickly and not be there for much longer. Whereas the meat will continue to burn for a while. And so it's a way of him talking about like the transience of the remainder of his life. But which is quite a cool thing. But I think maybe we miss that because we don't have this sort of vocabulary like in our head all the time.
Yeah, totally. I think just coming back to what we were talking about a second ago with the
Sorry.
no, that's totally fine. That's a really interesting point. With Jesus fulfilling all the different elements of the sacrificial or of the Levitical system, it seeing it that way, it kind of helps us to avoid playing the game of spot the Jesus, which I think is just a good strategy in general when it comes to the Old Testament. It's also one of the things that we spoke about in that earlier module, where trying to find different characters or objects or whatever to kind of map Jesus straight onto. It can come across a little bit simplistic, and isn't the most helpful way to think about what how Jesus is the fulfillment of what we see in the Old Testament. We see a much richer picture when we actually get to understanding what's going on there first, and seeing how there's an escalation that goes on with Jesus and how he brings things together in some powerful ways.
Yeah, I think you see that in like the contrived nature that has to sometimes exist if you want to try and explain every verse separately as Jesus fulfilling it. Like to go back to the sin and the guilt offering, for instance, right? So they do the exact same thing. The only difference is that the guilt offering has like a reparation cost that you also pay. And so now if you want to try and explain how Jesus fulfills the sin offering, and you try and give some explanation, and now you also need to explain how he fulfills the guilt offering. You're like, well, where's the like, you could say, well, he made a payment of his life on the cross or something. But like in the guilt offering, it's a monetary payment. Like it's not, so you would be quite hard pressed to like try and figure how that would work, and you probably have to jump through some loopholes. Whereas if you understand, no, these are just two ways of this role in the broader system working, and Jesus fulfills that entire system, then you're in a much better place to say, yeah, he atones the place, he atones God's temple, insofar as he cleanses us from sin.
Then just one more thing before we move on. What you said now about the drink offering and how that makes so much more sense when we actually have more familiarity with Leviticus. It also just made me think of other New Testament language, like in Romans 12, where Paul talks about believers being offering their bodies as living sacrifices. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't have many thoughts on that, but I do think if you think about the sacrifice or the offering as like the place where that enables communion with God, maybe it can be quite helpful. So, well, there's two things actually. So the one is talking about it as living sacrifice is interesting because, characteristically the animal would die when it gets cut up and burnt on an altar. And even Jesus' sacrifice is him dying. But there's a sense in which, like, if it's a living sacrifice, it's something that you, like your life as a whole, as it continues, is this offering that you're making to God as part of your relationship with him, which is really, like, a really nice way of thinking about it, like how you should think about your life, really. And I think that is what Paul then goes on to unpack and explain a bit more in Romans 12 to 15. I think it's recognizing the place of the offering or the sacrifice in the old system it was a means by which you could have communion with God. You could celebrate a life with him or covenant with him. And so now Paul is saying, okay, take that idea and apply that to the way that you see yourself living as part of God's people now. So it's a dimension of the offering that maybe we don't always think about, because to us it's, the animal dies in the offering and Christ died on the cross. Cool, that works out really well. But now Paul is saying living sacrifice. Okay, whatever. I won't think about that too much. But it's like, no, well, the offering has a lot of dimensions. Some of the offerings didn't have animals dying, right? Like the grain and the drink offering had no animals dying, but they serve to like bolster or express this covenant relationship with God.
Yeah, cool. Our next question is thinking about also about the New Testament and how some of these ideas of the priesthood is pulled through. So in the New Testament, it talks about all Christians as priests. How does that fit with the Old Testament, where only a specific group were allowed to be priests?
Yeah, so I think one of the books I put in just so people can get more information about this. So one of the books that I reference in the resources as well as in one of the footnotes is this book by, I think it's Andrew Malone, called God's Mediators. And it's in the NSBT series. It's like these grey books, a lot of grey books of different kinds.
Like this one as well.
Yeah, like that one. Yeah, exactly. Are we just showing off our Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord? We both have a copy of this one.
Actually, another great book on Leviticus.
Yes.
Not related to what Roland's about to talk about, but maybe he also covers it. I don't know what you're about to say.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so in God's Mediators, it talks about the priesthood. The book is like broken up into two parts. The one is the special class of priests among God's people, and then the other one is how God's people as a whole are priests. And it does sort of a biblical theology of both of those. So I highly recommend reading that if you're more interested in this question. But the short answer is, we didn't talk about it, but it's quite right. The New Testament does talk about all believers being a priesthood. So that you'll see in 1 Peter 2, 1 Peter chapter 2. It says, and it's quite interesting because it's interesting for a number of reasons. Maybe I'll read it and then we can talk about it. So it says, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And then a bit later in the same chapter it says, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. What's interesting about that first one is that it connects being God's temple with being his priesthood. So it says you're being built up into the spiritual house, and then it says a holy priesthood, which I think is quite interesting. Like when I think spiritual house, I think temple. And it makes a lot of sense, right? If you think of the priests as those people who would make the temple accessible, and by making the temple accessible, make God's presence accessible, then that is what all believers do today, right? As we proclaim the word throughout the world, as we build one another up, what we're doing is we're making it possible for people to enter the temple. As soon as they believe in Christ, and they come to faith, they become part of God's temple, and so thereby have access to him as well. So that would be one example of how we are priests. But that's not new. That idea of talking about the whole of God's people as a priesthood isn't new to the New Testament. So if you go back to Exodus 19, where God is making the covenant with Israel for the first time, he says, let's read from verse 5 and 6. He says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Okay? And it's noteworthy that that's exactly what Peter's like riffing off of that in 2 verse 9. I mean, he just said the same thing, a royal priesthood, so a kingdom of priests, a chosen possession, holy nation. So Peter definitely has that in mind when he's saying this in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, I think the way that it worked was that so if you think of the priests as those who make the temple accessible, right? Then, of course, there's the priests in Israel who are doing that to everyone, but the whole nation of Israel needs to sort of function vaguely as a holy zone. So they need to keep the cleanness, the purity laws, and separate the unclean from the holy, and all those sorts of things. It's the responsibility of everyone to do that in order to make the temple system continue to work, right? And we see that most, like, extremely, I guess, in the exile. When Israel aren't doing that, they don't do their job, they disobey God, they turn after other gods and all those things, they get exiled, and there isn't a temple anymore for anyone to come and access. So in a sense, the nation of Israel is a nation, a priest to the other nations. It's making God in his temple accessible to all the nations of the world. Yeah, and so they were doing a similar thing, although obviously different, because of how the nature of the temple has evolved. But they were, as a nation, as a collective people of God, doing a similar thing to what we do now. So it's always sort of been a responsibility of the people of God to make the temple known and make it accessible.
And that essentially was through God's covenant relationship with his people. It's interesting that in Exodus 19, this is now something that he's saying specifically to the Israelites. This is his chosen people, apart from the Canaanites, apart from the Amalekites, apart from everybody else, which is also something that you explored a little bit in the previous lesson in the Patriarch, where it's that particular line that God is following his covenant promises through Abraham's line, specifically through Isaac and now the nation of Israel. In Peter, it's no longer just Israel. It's no longer just Jews. It's Jew and Gentile. It also makes me think of what Paul says in Galatians 3, that neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, no distinction. Anybody and everybody can be part of the people of God now through faith, and in so doing mediate his covenant and his presence to the rest of the world.
Yeah, so that's super interesting, isn't it? Because in Peter, he's obviously reframing these promises these words, because in in Exodus, when he talks about a nation, he's talking about an actual nation that God is creating through that covenant. But when Peter says you are now a holy nation, he's not talking about a physical nation that has a land and stuff, because Christians are spread throughout, the church is spread throughout the world. So that's quite a cool way of thinking about it. And again, I mean, it's good that you mention the Patriarch talk, because there we introduce this category of spiritual descendancy, and Peter is in a sense picking up on that when he talks about us being a spiritual house. I think that these days we tend to think of spiritual in a particular way, like ephemeral or non-material or something like that. But I think your default when you read the New Testament, not always, but your default should be, when I read spiritual, I mean the author means established by the presence of the Holy Spirit. Because of how pivotal that moment had. So we are a spiritual house by virtue of the Holy Spirit living in us. So yeah.
Cool. Any closing thoughts?
No, I think that's all I got. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. And this is our middle questions video. We've got the next lesson coming out tomorrow evening, same time. That will be focusing on the king. For that lesson, if you've got questions on that, then try get that in to us by the Friday, so that we have time to record another video like this on next week Saturday morning, and that'll be out the same time next week.